You are a soldier. You are far away from home, far away from the friends and family you care about. You are fighting a doomed battle in a doomed war, one where there is no escape for you. You are a French soldier. On the 27th of May, the overall commander of the French forces in Indochina would change from General Salon to General Henri Navarre. The war had been brewing for 6 years, and the choice to appoint Navarre as the general commander of the French forces was not done without pause. Navarre had no experience in Indochina, and he himself was more aware of this than anyone else. He would then spend his first 3 crucial weeks traveling and visiting the front lines across the entirety of Indochina. He talked to local commanders on the ground and familiarized himself with the war, and his discoveries, well, they were grim. The Viet Minh were at a significant advantage over the French. The 6 years of fighting so far were brutal, but it had affected the French more than it had the Viet Minh. The French were also outnumbered. They could only count on around 175,000 troops in the French Expeditionary Force, with some of them coming from metropolitan France, but also from other French colonies, and even from local Indo-Chinese forces. The Viet Minh, on the other hand, could count on close to double what the French could, with them having 125,000 main force troops, 75,000 regional troops, and somewhere around 150,000 to 300,000 militias. But the French problems ran much deeper than just having less men. Planning had also become severely deficient. The French forces didn't have an overall operational plan in place anymore. Things were just planned day by day. The French did still hold some key advantages that they would quickly come to rely on: the air and the sea. The French Air Force and the French Navy were practically uncontested in Indochina, allowing them to operate freely. But this by itself would not win the war for the French. For them to have any hope in succeeding, they would have to take the initiative. But in order for him to take back that initiative, Navarre would have to come up with a new plan, and a plan he came up with. Navarre's plan would begin with Operation Hirondelle, wherein 3 parachute battalions landed behind enemy lines in Lang Song and managed to destroy roughly 5,000 tons of enemy equipment, and then retreated to the coast in order to be evacuated by the French Navy. Next came Operation Camargue, where French forces would attempt to destroy the 95th Vietnamese Regiment in order to clear threats to Route 1. Now, Route 1 was especially important as it ran for the entirety of Vietnam and was used as an important supply line for French forces. The French forces invaded the area by land and sea in order to attempt to encircle the regiment, but this would fail and the regiment would manage to retreat with relatively light casualties. Regardless, Navarre would press on, with Operation Mouette being launched in Phu Ngoc Quan. The French forces would fight the 320th Viet Minh Division and would seemingly manage to mangle the division in order to stop its offensive capabilities. But by the time Operation Mouette had ended, Navarre was in command of the French forces for over 6 months by this point. He had in the process gained significant victories for the French forces with few losses. In many ways, he had done what his predecessor failed to do: regain the initiative in Indochina. But in less than a year, Navarre would be returning to France not as a hero, but as a failure. Now what happened? To understand the series of events that would follow Operation Mouette, we need to first ask one simple question. Why was France even fighting this war in the first place? Wars aren't fought for random reasons. They're fought for political goals. It's a fundamental fact of war, and so it's not surprising that when Navarre had been appointed, he had asked the French government what they wanted him to do. And it's here where things begin to fall apart for the French, because the government couldn't give him a clear answer. They could only say that they wanted him to gain a situation favorable to France at the negotiating table. Navarre had also asked the government whether or not he had to specifically defend Laos, to which they never gave him a clear answer. We know now, with the benefit of hindsight, that the French government never had any intention in properly defending Laos. Why they didn't tell Navarre that is complicated and likely due to several reasons. But their inability to give Navarre a clear answer as to whether or not he had to defend Laos would have drastic consequences. Additionally, in October of 1952, well before Navarre had even been appointed, the French would launch an operation, that being Operation Lorraine, in a desperate attempt to stop the Viet Minh advance onto various outposts on the Black River. This would prove to be a complete failure, and Giap managed to achieve several major victories in the war in the process. But one French outpost would, however, hold out against the Viet Minh assault. Nha San. This would eventually lead to the Battle of Nha San and end with a Viet Minh defeat. This battle would also be unique, since the outpost was cut off from normal supply routes and had to be entirely supplied by air. This outpost would eventually be entirely evacuated by air in August of 1953, under Navarre's supervision. But what makes Nha San so important to the story is that the battle would begin to affect the thinking of Navarre and his staff, a thinking that would eventually evolve into a new battle strategy, the Hérisson, or the Hedgehog. The Hérisson would be a fortified position behind enemy lines that could be entirely resupplied by air. This fortified position could then be used as a basing point for mobile attacks against the enemy. It would in many ways allow for the French to use their greatest assets and ignore many of the challenges in the Indochina War, but the French staff wouldn't have much time to deliberate. Giap was invading Laos. This invasion presented Navarre with a large problem, that being there weren't any French forces in the area that could even hope to stop the invasion. Navarre was then forced to choose between defending Laos or abandoning it, and to him, he only had one real choice: to defend Laos and to use the untested Hérisson tactic to stop it, in a valley called Dien Bien Phu. Now, Dien Bien Phu was located in a valley that was surrounded by hills on all sides, and the reasoning behind choosing Dien Bien Phu as the location to use the Hérisson is complicated. Even Navarre himself thought that using the Hérisson in Dien Bien Phu was a mediocre solution to its problems, but he saw it as the only way to stop the Viet Minh in the area. Navarre had considered Dien Bien Phu to be the main hub where the supplies into Laos would be transported through, and that the flat valley would allow for the use of French armor. Additionally, French intelligence had reported that the Viet Minh would be unable to mobilize a large enough force to contest the French in the area, which would allow for large French attacks outside of Dien Bien Phu. But despite that, Navarre continued with his plan by launching Operation Castor, wherein French parachute battalions landed and secured Dien Bien Phu, although not without initial difficulties for the Viet Minh forces that were stationed there. And by the 20th of November, the operation was over, and French forces began to move there in force. But it would be here that French problems would begin to set in, as Giap had quickly seen through Navarre's plan and began to respond accordingly. The various mobile attacks launched out of Dien Bien Phu were intercepted by Viet Minh troops and completely failed. Navarre had also tried to send leftover forces from Operation Muette on foot towards Dien Bien Phu, but they were easily intercepted by Giap. It was clear by this point that French intelligence was severely misinformed. Unlike what they had thought, the Viet Minh were able to mobilize and organize a large force nearby Dien Bien Phu extremely quickly. Worse, the Hérisson relied entirely on air supply, but Dien Bien Phu's isolated location was at the very limit of the operational range of many of the French planes. French fighters in Dien Bien Phu could only operate for around 10 minutes before having to return to Hanoi, and the French were rudely informed that their control over the skies wasn't as secure as they had originally hoped. The Viet Minh managed to use anti-aircraft and artillery guns in the area, allowing them to harass French planes and eventually begin bombing the airstrip itself. By March 27th, the last French plane would be able to successfully fly out of the airstrip in Dien Bien Phu, and supplies from there on out had to be parachuted by crates instead. But what little was recovered from those crates would not be enough to sustain the French. This battle for logistics, though, wasn't just limited to the French. Giap himself had to deal with several logistical issues, but whereas the intelligence reports from the French were somewhat correct in assuming that the Viet Minh would have trouble supplying their troops in the area, they severely underestimated their ability to adapt and expand their logistical capacity. Makeshift roads were constructed in camouflage, truck drivers would drive in specific portions of the road and transfer supplies from one truck to the next. They would drive day and night, and even forego the use of their headlights to prevent them from being spotted from French aircraft, and an entire army of human porters would be organized to supply the Viet Minh. All this made it so that by the time the actual battle for Dien Bien Phu had begun, the French were in a terrible position. They were outnumbered 5-1 and completely surrounded. They were outgunned by Viet Minh artillery, and crucially, they had a lack of construction materials, which severely limited their defenses. The Viet Minh would also use their artillery extremely effectively, using direct fire instead of traditional indirect fire, and creating both fake artillery positions and camouflage positions in order to confuse French counter-artillery. The battle would eventually become a brutal siege, with the French positions slowly but surely being chipped away, until by the 7th of May, the battle would end. The entire French force in the area would be killed, wounded, or captured. But it was by no means an easy battle. The Viet Minh would also sustain high casualties, but it would still mark the end of French aspirations in Dien Bien Phu, and with it, the end of the war. What followed was the 1954 Geneva Accords, wherein the French and the Viet Minh, alongside China, the USSR, the UK, and the US would participate. China had actually been putting some pressure on the Democratic Republic of Vietnam to negotiate with France for some time now, but the decisive victory at Dien Bien Phu had colored the negotiations throughout the accords, and eventually, the conference would resolve in the French pulling out of Indochina, in exchange for independent Laos, Cambodia, and southern Vietnam from North Vietnam. And that would be the end of this war in Indochina.